So it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, André Comandon. And I think what he's going to be sharing with you today is going to be pretty exciting. It's definitely a new avenue for us. As the Historical Association, we tend to be pretty rooted in the past and maybe slow to embrace new technologies, but this is a very exciting project that's just in its early phases, which will be some very technological mapping and a way to share history in a new way that he's going to talk a lot more about. So Dr. André Comandon is a research scientist at the METRANS Transportation Consortium, which is a research center at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. He studies and maps how the movement of people through migration and daily mobilities change cities in the US and globally. He has lived here in Madrid since 2022. So we're very excited to have his expertise now in the North Country and really looking forward to what he has to share with us today. So take it away, André.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to share something that is really in its infancy, right? I know that usually those talks tend to be the culmination of a project, and sometimes there's a book. Here, it's very much the beginning of a project, right? As Carlene mentioned, I am new to the region. I am looking forward to being more involved in the community. And part of what I do as a researcher is create what we call community-centered programs or co-creation of research. And what that involves is that we as researchers have a set of skills, but we want those skills to be applied to something that's relevant to the community. And what that means usually is that we go to the community for questions that are interesting to you, rather than what we as researchers tend to be interested in, which tends to be quite insular and specialized, right? And so this is kind of the idea I want to bring to you today, is to start a project that puts you at the center of the program, right? And gets resources, questions, things that are interesting, and then I can apply my skills to develop something that hopefully maybe in a year or two I can come back and show the results, right? And share something that will be useful to all of you, and that becomes a resource that is evolving and kind of, as Karen says, adds a new types of resource to places like the association here. So I will say a little bit more about my work through the presentation, right? There will be opportunities that, to talk about that and why I'm interested in this, but broadly speaking, this has nothing to do with what I usually do in my day-to-day work. I use historical resources. I definitely do a lot of mapping, but I don't study the region. As Karen mentioned, I work for the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, so a lot of my work is actually based in California. But this is something I'm interested in learning more about and look forward to learning more about in the future. Okay, so one side note also, I realized that the flyer made the idea of mines prominent. And so just a caveat, if you were expecting to learn about Benson mines, which is pictured in the flyer, or any mine in the county, this is not going to be the focus. So I'm sorry to disappoint if that was the expectation, but there will be a lot of maps, and I will have examples of maps that include mines. All right. So to begin, a quick guide to what I'll be talking about. I'll start by really introducing maps and why maps are useful for history, but more generally, and what the purposes are and why we tend to be very interested in them, right? They have a great appeal, and there's a number of reasons for that. Then the kind of the core and the main takeaway from this is going to be in the second section, which is what we can do with old maps, right? So we have examples of maps from various decades over there. If you want to see some real life ones, I have plenty of pictures in the presentation, but there's many things we can do nowadays with historical maps. So I want to give you a number of examples to basically inspire you and to kind of tell you what's possible, so that you have hopefully ideas for things that we could do as a community. And so the next section will go over some of the tools, some of the limitations or challenges involved in going from a paper map to a digital map. And then I'll finish with basically what is a proposal and what should be a Q&A, or really an opportunity for you to share your ideas. And of course, if you don't have ideas right now, I'll put my email. I'll be looking forward to hearing from everyone. All right. And if at any points you have questions, things that don't make sense, please feel free to interrupt me. I won't mind at all. All right. So why maps? We use maps quite regularly, usually for directions to know where places are. And in this way, maps have been relevant and useful for a long time. You have here a map of the early subway system in New York City. And those maps are nice because they allow us to see how things evolved, right? So to take the example of the subway, there's a great book about the construction of the subway from its inception to today. And you can see how it evolved, how the lines were built out, and what was involved in terms of making decisions about which places should be prioritized, and how the addition of lines, for example, to Brooklyn or to the Bronx expanded the region greatly and allowed for the settlement of those areas that before the introduction of the metro were really not settled at all. So maps for directions, something that we use every day nowadays, right? We have access to things like Google Maps or equivalent on our phones. They're everywhere. But they've always been kind of a mainstay of mapping and why we use them regularly. But maps are also a way of understanding our environment. Right, so this is an early map of the Adirondack Park, and there's many things going on here, right? It tells us about where things are, right? So it overlaps with the first purpose of maps, but it also tells us about the kind of land cover there is, right? Where it's forested, where the lakes are. It can tell us where watersheds are. It can tell us about the kind of soil there is in different places. All these things are useful in a practical way, right? If you're in mining, if you're in agriculture, all those purposes, we rely on knowing where those things are through maps, but it also allows us to understand our broader environment and how our environment is changing, right? Again, I'm going to go back and forth between historical maps and how we can use them today. And so, for example, with these kinds of maps, we can see, okay, forests were covering that much of the county in the early 20th century. Today, it's shrunk or it's expanded, or the forest lines have moved around. All those things are useful for understanding how things work, but also how things are changing and how they might change in the future. One of the most important purposes of maps, at least in my opinion, and something that gets closer to what I actually study, is that maps are essential for creating boundaries, right? And we are a culture, a society that is based on boundaries. We have state boundaries, we have town boundaries, we have national boundaries. And those, we have parcel boundaries, right? We are a society built on private property. And so knowing where boundaries are is essential. It also affects how things work, right? And because boundaries tend to be arbitrary, right? We take a piece of paper, we trace them and say, this is where we agree this boundary is. How we place boundaries can really shape the trajectory of a town, for example, or in the case of what I study, I'll show an example in a minute, how a town is segregated, right? Where infrastructure goes, right? How we place highways can be extremely consequential, right? Whether we decide to put the highway going around the town or right through it, right? Which was a source of great debate in New York City, for example, really matters for the long term, because freeways, once they're there to stay, right? It's very rare that a freeway is taken away. So boundaries, I think, is something that's extremely consequential. And so we have a great many maps that show that. And we can use, again, historical maps to understand how those boundaries change, right? In case of towns in Central and Lower Orange County, I know that someone involved with the association went through the painstaking work of tracing those boundaries for every time there was a change, right? And so we have a record of how each town evolved over time, how they were divided, how the boundaries moved over time. But maps are so great for telling stories, right? And so we're getting to a less conventional use of maps, but something that I think is extremely important for our purposes. And this is, I think, probably one of the most famous maps. I don't know how many of you have seen that before. I think it's a great, probably one of the best maps ever created. But it shows the Napoleon's 1812 campaign in Russia, right? So it starts at the boundary, and the reddish line or shape shows the number of soldiers, right? So the thickness of the line is proportional to the number of soldiers that were in the army at the beginning, right? So this is 1812, beginning. That reminds me, let me do something quickly so that people on Zoom can see. All right, so right, can everyone see the pointer on the screen? Yeah, okay. So right at this end, this is the beginning of the campaign, there's 420,000 soldiers. As they move through Russia, you can see the number of soldiers dwindling. So the line is proportional to the number of soldiers. So every time it shrinks, soldiers die. And you can see by the time it reaches Moscow, it's much smaller. And the dark line represents soldiers coming back from the campaign. So that by the end, right, in 1813, only 10,000 soldiers are left, right? So this is something that in a simple graphic, right, you get both spatial information, right, the progression of the campaign, and a really quite a brutal story of the war, right? And so this is a very effective way of telling multiple things. And then even better is underneath, you have this, this line here shows the temperature as people were moving through Russia as the main source of deaths, right? The reason that so many soldiers were dying is because they were going through a brutal winter. And you can see how the temperature rising and lowering had an impact on the number of deaths, right? And so this is an example where it doesn't really look like a map, but it is a map and it tells a story. Right, so this is, I think, where we kind of end up and where it gets, to me, really interesting, is that those historical maps are a great way for understanding our contemporary world. And so one of the examples I mentioned earlier is that boundary drawing can have long-lasting impact. So some of you might be familiar with redlining maps. Those are maps that were created in the 1930s by, for a purpose on the surface of insurance of homes and as guides for investing in neighborhoods, right? And so people would go to cities and assess neighborhoods and say, this one is good for investment. It's a vibrant neighborhood. I think it's going to do well in the next decade. This one is not so good. It's a declining neighborhood. You should not invest there, right? And so they created those zones, right, where red, those areas in red are the bad areas, and the ones in blue and green, with green being the best places, are the ones that are good, right? The problem with that is that this classification was highly racialized, right? If you read the documents that go along with those maps, it's really harrowing. You will see language like, oh, there's incursion of I don't remember what the wording is, but it's basically an extremely racist set of documents that says if there is any Jews, if there's any black people, if there is any Mexicans, this is a no-go, right? All right, so this is in the 30s. It's not that surprising that this was going on. What's interesting and really kind of brings that to life is when you can use those maps to understand what's happening today. And this is going to be the next thing I talk about is how do we get there, right? So there's a couple of ways we can do that, right? One way is going to be to take those maps and digitize them, meaning we take the paper map and put them on a computer so we can manipulate them this way. Another way is and I'm going to mention it now because it's less relevant, is to do what we call geocode information. Right? So geocoding means, basically, you have an address, right? Everyone has an address, and we can use this address to put it somewhere on a map, right? So to give you a concrete example, all right, this is a map of New York City. It doesn't come out great on the screen. It's a little bit light. But you can see here the tip of Manhattan. There's all those dots. Each dot represents a building in New York City, and each one has an ethnicity associated with it. So again, it's a bit small, but for example, green is English or Scottish, pink is Irish, orange or yellow is Russian, blue is German, and purple is Caribbean or West Indies, and dark blue is Italy, right? So all of these dots represent an ethnicity. And so you can kind of see that in the this is 1850, right? There's a large German population right there, right? And that Irish is really dominant in this part of the city. And so this is an example of geocoding, right? They took census records where every person had an address, looked at their ethnicity, and were able to put those addresses on the map and therefore create this. It gets really cool when you do that for repeated decades. So this is the same thing for 1880. So you see two things. One, the city is growing, and the distribution of ethnicities is also shifting. You still see a high concentration of Germans on the Lower East Side here, but also an expansion into Brooklyn. And you see an expansion towards Central Park with, again, a dominance of Irish and kind of a splattering of other ethnicities throughout. And then we move to 1910, and here we see, again, a great expansion, a complete shift here in the Lower East Side, where Russians really kind of become the dominant group, right? And so, by the way, if you want to look at this, it's called Mapping Historical New York. There's great resources there. But it shows you a cool example of what's possible when you have information about people's address, right? It can be a difficult process if the addresses are not perfect. It takes some cleaning to get there, but it allows us to basically pinpoint where things are on the map and create something like that. What I'm more interested in is what we call georeferencing a map, right? So this is where we take a paper map, we scan it, and then we tell the computer, this is where this map belongs on a digital map, right? So we're assigning coordinates to every point on the map, so then we can overlay this map with other maps, and they will match in terms of location. And so this is a project that was done using those redlining maps I showed earlier, right? And what they did is they took those maps and looked at the areas that were coded as being the worst neighborhoods to show that these boundaries have had an impact on cities that has persisted to this very day, right? So this is an example in Richmond, Virginia. And what it shows is the disparities in tree cover in neighborhoods that were redlined and those that were not, or those that were in the best classification. And what you see is the neighborhoods that were redlined that are all around downtown have a much lower tree cover than all the other neighborhoods. And this has very deep consequences for the city, because if you then look at temperatures, tree covers are an extremely important source of temperature mitigation. And so what you see is that those neighborhoods that were redlined have temperatures that are much higher than the rest of the city on a warm summer day. And so the city that's worse in this respect is Portland, Oregon, where, for example, if it's 90 degrees on a summer day, if you are in a neighborhood that was formerly classified as best, it would be 82, right, compared to the city average. If you were in a neighborhood that was classified as worse, it would be 95, right? Huge difference from 82 to 95, depending on how those boundaries were drawn almost a century ago, right? And so that really shows two things. It shows the usefulness of historical maps and shows how consequential those boundaries and those decisions were, and how they kind of persist over time. And so this is getting a lot closer to what I do. I actually study how cities have inequality built into them, right? That are kind of embedded in the built environment. And because the built environment is so persistent, right? Houses stand, especially around here where we have many houses that are more than a century old. It's rare that cities change a lot, right? The streets are very persistent, the houses are very persistent. And so how we kind of imagine those cities, how we regulate them, how we draw boundaries around them can have consequences for the long term and really shape how a city, how a region evolves over time. And so this is the kind of thing I'm really interested in, is in understanding how things that we do through our planning of cities affects our future, right? And how it's kind of constrains our ability to deal with things like changing climate or really persistent inequality or high poverty. All those things can be traced a lot of times in some respect to the built environment. All right, so these are all examples of what is possible, right, through the digitization of historical maps. Again, not necessarily directly relevant to our area, but I think that hopefully it inspires some ideas for what might be interesting to see. Now I want to talk a little bit about how we get there, right? Because these are great projects. They're not easy to get to in terms of getting to those outcomes. So the first thing I've mentioned is that we start with paper maps, and paper maps can be a lot of trouble, right? I have very technical language here. They're fragile, large, and faulty, right? And so the maps there that are on display, these are pretty great. They're manageable. They can be flattened pretty easily. A lot of maps are much larger, right? They're rolled up. They're folded many times. They become very fragile. Digitizing those can be extremely expensive because you have to have the capacity, the technology to do that. And so this is the first obstacle, is actually getting them from paper to digital format. The next issue is that we're dealing with is that our world is not flat. Right? Hopefully, this is not a controversial statement. And what that means practically for us is that when we take a map and we put things in space, we have to be careful about how we translate something that in reality is on a sphere onto a 2D space, a flat space. And so this is an example that I did using a map that was drawn in such a way that it does not really take into account the sphere nature of our planet, right? And what you can see is that when I geo-reference this map, the boundaries of towns, they match pretty well, but they don't quite match, right? So you can see, for example, right here, the colored boundary is what's on the map, and the dark boundary is what's the actual boundary. And so you can see this shift in a lot of places where there's a color boundary is what's on the historical map, and the dark one is what should be, right? They should align perfectly, and yet they don't. The reason for that is that this map is not what we call, it's not projected, right? The projection is the process of converting something that is spherical onto a 2D plane. And in this process, there's decisions that are involved, right? Because we cannot preserve the sphere nature of coordinates onto a flat surface. And so we have to make decisions about how we're going to distort things, right? So one way is to maintain distances, right? So that everything is in an equidistant way, and we are prioritizing this. Another way would be to preserve the shape of things, right? So same thing, if you looked at the world map, a lot of times you'll see continents, and they look very different than they would if you were to look at these continents from space, right? Especially near the poles. That's because when you put something that is here on the flat surface, everything gets distorted, right? And so how we distort things is extremely important. And a lot of historical maps, they didn't know about that, right? They just kind of drew things in a way that was useful, or that was just the best they could do with the technology they had. And so the further we go back in time, the harder it can be to really match what we have on paper to what we want on the computer. Starting in the late 19th century, usually, we get to a point where things, the technology and the knowledge about mapping is really basically gets to a point where it's not that different from what we know now in terms of the basics. So there's a fair amount of time where we can use the maps and they're digitizable in a way that works rather well. This map, I think, I want to say it's definitely from the 1800s. I think it might be from 1869, right? So again, it's mid 19th century. Technology was and knowledge was not widespread at this point, and so we see some of those issues with in the process of digitization. Right, but even then, right? So at this point, we've gone through two steps. We've digitized the map, right? So we've taken a photo of it, basically brought it onto the computer, and through this process, we've now matched this map to a location on the digital reference, right? So we now have this map in a way that could match against any other map. But if we wanted to do something like those redlining maps that I showed you, there's one more step, right? So if we want to be able to manipulate the map really well, or if we want to use the boundaries, for example, because they're meaningful, we have to then convert what is on paper into a purely digital version, right? Meaning that all we have is the boundaries, and those boundaries have information attached to them, right? Because in this version, right? So in this version, all we have is a picture of the map, right? We don't have any information attached to them. Each of those towns, like we don't know. We can see it on the picture that, for example, this is Canton, this is, right? That's Potsdam, right? Right. So we can see that on the map because it's written, but the computer doesn't know that, right? There's no way of linking what we see to what the computer actually has access to in terms of information. And so the last step is to get to this point where we tell the computer, okay, this unit, this square, for example, corresponds to Potsdam. And to do that, we actually have to trace those boundaries manually. Okay, and so this is an example. Actually, this was a story by NCPR back in April. Nancy Bernstein does a lot of maps for, I think, the Adirondack Explorer. You might have seen those maps, and she does exactly that, right? She traces maps and selects what she wants to see on the map and traces it by hand, and then publishes those maps. And so what she does manually is what you would do on a computer as well. It would be the exact same process, so that we can get to a map where the computer knows, okay, this area corresponds to Potsdam, this area corresponds to Canton, so on and so forth, right? And one of the things that's changing now, that used to be the process until very recently, the technology now, thanks to artificial intelligence, is getting to a point where the computer is learning to do that for us. Right? So the computers are getting so good at recognizing images that you can say, okay, here's a map, figure it out, right? And the computer will say, okay, I recognize that shape as being St. Lawrence County. I'm going to match that against St. Lawrence County. Now I recognize that this has the word Potsdam written on it, so it must be that this little square corresponds to Potsdam.
The basic lines that are created, do they reflect the surveyed lines that have been assessed by the people who have gone out and done that survey?
If the map is clear enough and the computer recognizes that, but it's really is amazing how quickly the image recognition technology is moving forward, to the point where there's still probably a human element in that you have to verify that, okay, this line does indeed correspond to this type of line. But in most cases, it's a matter of simplifying the map to a point where the computer can understand it and then do the rest of the work. So at this point, I think there's still a mix, but there is a lot of innovation and a lot of progress in terms of automating some of these steps that until recently were quite labor intensive. All right, so I just want to give you another quick example. I said I would talk about Benson mines briefly. So here it is. This is what what we call a base map would look like on a modern mapping software, right? So we call GIS software for Geographic Information System. This is just kind of the general name for the kind of software that's used for mapping and spatial analysis. But this is basically a map that shows you where things are, and that is 100% accurate, right? That's why it's called a base map, because everything can be mapped against that. And if it matches in terms of location, then you know it's accurate, right? So it's basically a perfect model of the Earth converted to a 2D plane. And so you can see here is the mines, right? And on this map, even though it's contemporary, it shows the mine as having, right, the open pit right here and the mine dump here. And that's kind of what it looks like on the base map. Now, what I've done is, and this is, right, a map of what the mine looks like, or what it looked like when it was active as decades ago, and you can see the corresponding shapes, right? So this is the open pit, and here it is on the map here. So these are different versions of the same thing. All right, so I've geo-referenced an older map. So this one is, I think, from the 1948, I believe. So this is basically the same map, but this time from 1948, right? So this type of map and this type of map are very similar. You can see that they represent a lot of the same information. And here, the main difference is that Benson Mines is just mentioned by name. It says Benson Mines right here, but you don't really see the open pit. You don't really see the mine up, right? So the level of detail is not quite as clear. And there's a few more differences you could see. But the cool thing is that now you have this older map overlaid onto a modern map. And right, so this is what it would have looked like back then. Then they were digging and kind of expanding this pit. And this is also right how you start building a story around maps. Right, you kind of bring different kinds of information together. You bring images, you bring narratives into it. And this is the last layer of that, right? So now what I've done is I've taken information about water bodies and rivers and overlaid that on top of the historical map. And what it shows us is that now the open pit is a lake, right? So you see here the same shape that we saw in the first one or in the historical map of the mine. And historically, there was no water there. So the water was not represented. And so now we can fetch a new layer that shows all the water bodies in the country or in the world, really, and see that indeed we have information about that, and we can show where the body of water is on the historical map, right? And this is really where there's a lot of potential for doing different things with maps, is that we can combine old information with newer information. We can see where, for example, certain types of land uses were and how they've changed over time. We can see where there used to be water and there's no longer water, and vice versa. And so I'll show you another example that's relevant to the region in a minute. But basically, once we have these steps done, we can do a lot of things, right? And so here's some examples that you might like to play around with. So this one is, let's see, can I get, how do I get out of the, I'm stuck with the laser pointer. And turn this off. Oh, yeah. All right. So this is a website. That's pretty great if it shows up. Ah, there it goes. All right. So this is a website that basically has done most of the work for you, right? So it's a David Rumsey map collection. They have hundreds of historical maps, and they've digitized them and they've georeferenced them. So here is a map of St. Lawrence County, and you can see that it is placed on the base map exactly where it should be. And there's a lot of things you can do here. You can set the transparency, right? So if you want to see what's behind the map, you can make it semi-transparent, so you can compare locations. You can compare different maps, right? So you could have two historical maps and put them side by side to see how they compare. It's basically a very accessible way of doing some of the things I've talked about, and to look at a collection of historical maps about the region. I will say that the types of maps is fairly limited in that it tends to be this kind of map that shows town boundaries, roads. There's not much more than that, right? So I think it's a good starting point, but there's so much more that could be done. And here is something that's closer to what I would like to move towards. So this is a web page that the Seaway Corporation has put together. And it's, I think, really well done in that it goes through the history of the Seaway, right? Has great images, has a narrative on the side, right? So you can see how different steps went through, where some of the involvement of different actors was, newspaper clippings. But the part I want to get to is there's a lot. It's pretty comprehensive. On which page?
Just the home.
Okay, let me reload. Or, oh, should I do the share again? Okay, let me try that. Right, like that. No. Because right, this is in the browser. Right. I'll just show this. Yeah, I'm not sure if I can. Right, it still doesn't show up. All right, so I'll just, I guess, show that for the room, and we can put the links maybe on the video. But basically, what this kind of platform allows you to do is something like that, where you can see on the left side the historical extent of the St. Lawrence River before the Seaway was built, and then if you slide this thing, you can see what it looks like today, right? And so you can go back and forth and compare then and today, which is a really neat way of using this type of mapping tool. And again, this is a very clear example. There's other ways you can do that. You can do that applied to any number of kind of before-after situation. But I thought this one was particularly relevant to this region, and I think is a good example of what's possible. And okay, let me return to this. Okay, but this part of the presentation works fine, right? Okay, so as we are wrapping up in terms of time that we have, this is pretty much also where I'm going to finish. But I want to go back to what I started with, which is this is a set of examples, right? It shows you how it's done, what's possible, examples of that. And so what I want to come back to is what's the story we want to tell, right? And how can we use some of those tools to tell a story? And so, yeah.
That's really relevant, something that was on NCCR this morning, the St. Lawrence outage change, because they're developing the Dakota Indians that are part of the Aspenati Reservation are developing a tourism situation. They're going to be taking people out on the water to tell their story. And this morning they told the story of how they lost so much land when the St. Lawrence River was developed. Yeah. And they, in the tour they point out this was land and we had people on it.
Yeah.
Really a story.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is exactly the kind of thing that's possible, and it helps to be able to see just how much land was lost and where it was lost. And it's true that a lot of the biggest changes are on reservation land. And so, yeah, I think that's exactly the kind of things that's can be brought to the fore, and I think that's I think can be very exciting. So just to finish off, I want to give you a couple more examples of what's out there and what's kind of low-hanging fruits and what's kind of how can that be developed. This is from data I pulled from the different censuses, right? So from 1850, 1900, and 1940, and it shows the breakdown of where people were born, right? So in 1850, you can see the population of the county. About 60% of people in the county were born in New York State, and about 20% of the county was foreign-born, with a large share of that being born in Canada, but actually a larger share being born abroad, the biggest groups being from the UK and Ireland. And by 1900, already the share of foreign-born people has shrunk substantially, and the share of people born in New York State increases. By 1940, we see that it's basically 90% of the people are born in the US, most of them born in the States, and a small share of people born abroad, with most of them now being born in Canada. And if you were to fast forward to today, the share of foreign-born people in the county is about 4%. Right? And so we see this shrinking, but what I want to emphasize here is that we have these data available, right? This is very quick. This is very, it's not simple. You have to know how to access them and process them, but we have access to the full census, right? It's every single person that was alive in 1850 all the way to 1940 is available through publicly, right? And so there is two versions of that. There's one where it's anonymous, right? We don't have the names and addresses of people. That's for basically what would be used for analysis, where we summarize those data in a way that gives us this kind of product. There is also the data where addresses are available. This is the kind of data that was used for this New York City example. And as of last year, 1950 was released. So those data are in the process of being digitized and made available to the public in this kind of format. That means that we can go all the way to 1950 now, because the period of limits on census data is 72 years. Right? So in 2032, the 1960 census will be released, the full census data. And so this is one type of resource that's available to us that I think is a lot of richness. There's information about occupation, there's information about tenure, about nativity. All these things are out there and usable. There's a lot of different maps, right? This is an example of a map that's upstairs. That's one of those larger maps, but it shows kind of land valuation in kind of the agricultural part of the county. Would be great to see how this compares to how land is valued and used today, right? So there's a lot of those maps that are not just boundaries or road maps that have this wealth of information, and that's out there. And I think there's got to be something that can be done with it. We just don't know what quite yet. But basically, what I've done is just to show you, right? I've created one of those pages, right? Like the Seaway one, that is a placeholder, right? At this point, I want to just create it and make it available so that hopefully, as I said, over time, I can develop a narrative and we can start adding maps and see things. And there could be multiple of those pages. But I think that I want you at this point to know that this is available, this is an option, and this is how you would go about doing it. And thank you.